Hello and welcome to the A-Form Show. My name is Alan George and thank you very much for tuning in. Each week, we sit across from thought leaders and change makers in the architecture and design space of the GCC. We dive deep into their experiences, both professionally and personally, and share their valuable insight as to what makes them tick. Our goal is to add value to your day and help you navigate your own personal creative journey. Finally, the opinions and the views of the guest speakers are that of their own. They do not necessarily represent the views and the opinions of the show or the host. This episode was recorded before the COVID-19 outbreak. We greatly appreciate our guests and listeners' support during these uncertain times. We hope that wherever you may be, you are healthy and in good company. Remember, we are all in this together and we will come out the other side. Stay safe, stay inspired. On this week's episode, we are joined by two guests coming together to share their insights on the topic of future-proofing architects. Much like the design of any project, an architectural or even design career requires the same amount of attention at all key stages, the lack of which has led to a rise of frustrated designers and, or worse, comfortably mediocre ones. Whilst there are many facets to this topic, we have decided to focus on the following two stages, if you will: education and mid-career, as these seem to be the critical pivoting points throughout one's design career. To share his insights, today we are joined by Dr. Shaji Panicker. He is currently an associate professor at the School of Design and Architecture of the Manipal University in Dubai. Over the past decade, Shaji has taught students of architecture both in the UAE and in India. This has given him a unique perspective to the teaching methodologies put in place across both countries. He has taught students at both the undergraduate level and the postgraduate level. He has seen both the education of architects and student mindsets change over his time as an educator. We are really grateful to have your presence with us today, and thank you very much for joining us. Finally, we are also joined by another familiar face, or in our listeners' case, a familiar voice. Rahul Sudheer joins the show yet again to share his thoughts on future-proofing architects. When we last spoke, Rahul was with the prestigious developer MR. Since then, Rahul has been part of many groundbreaking projects and currently practices as an architect with Broadway Mallion. Rahul has also spent a good amount of time in jury crits with students here in the UAE. That has undoubtedly given him a unique perspective about the architectural education sector in the country. What makes today's show really interesting is that Dr. Shaji Panicker has taught Mr. Rahul Sudheer during their time together at the RV College in Bangalore in India. Yes, it is quite indeed the student and the teacher joining us today. With this dynamic duo, this show promises to be a deep dive into architectural education and its direct impact on one's career later on in life. We're going to get into the do's and the don'ts of being an architect. More importantly, we're going to get into the how and the why as well. We couldn't be more excited about this show, so without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week. These are exciting times we live in. We have a virus that's out to get all of us right now. But apart from that, for the show, this is the first ever round table that we're having. And it's not really a round table in the sense that the table that we're at is literally not round. And we don't really have a lot of people, but we have a lot of high quality people joining us today for a topic which I think is relevant for pretty much every architect, if not every designer out there. And we are joined today by a repeat guest who has joined us on the show before. We have Rahul Sudheer with us today. And in addition, we have Dr. Shaji Panicker, who is also joining us today. Shaji has an immense amount of knowledge and an immense amount of experience in the field of architecture as a faculty member at various colleges. And the interesting dynamic that we have today is that Shaji, at one point, used to be the professor of Rahul. And considering that dynamic, the topic of future-proofing architects seemed to be the best possible combination for the both of them. So we don't really have a script for this one. We don't really have any kind of guidelines. So anything's on the table. Feel free to take it wherever you want. To kick things off, just downstairs as we were getting our coffee, we were talking about how internships may be a good starting point to kind of see where things are and where they could be. Because internships is kind of like that bridge in between both, in between practice and between the actual design studio. So, Rahul, thoughts on where internships are?
So yeah, like I was saying earlier, one of the interesting aspects is that I tend to compare how students are being prepared here in this region as compared to how I was personally prepared. There was never a conversation where we would be like, oh, are you ready for your first job? Generally, I got a feeling like when I was in college, we were being prepared as design thinkers. I'm not saying that it's not happening here, but it's just that there was a lot less emphasis on preparing you in terms of skill set, or your graphic skills or your software skills and things like that. There's less emphasis on that. But I think maybe it's also a case of where we're heading currently, where there seems to be a lot more emphasis in those kind of software skills and those kind of things, where it's almost a case of colleges trying to prepare those students for that first job, right? That becomes your sort of first task or your first checkbox that you need to kind of take. Maybe Shaji sir can kind of talk about it better, but this is a general feeling that I get.
True.
But I think internship is a good starting point. But again, like when I was a student, like we never thought about internship as our first job, right? Because we used to do our internship during our college days and things like that. Right. So this is another interesting aspect, which I feel like internship is also about building relationship, right? With someone or with a company or something, like where you give a sample of what you have to offer. So my thought process is you can either do it during your college days, where you already set a sort of relationship. And then when you're out of college, you know where your first job is probably going to be, where they're likely to sort of offer you something, right? Or you could just go about focus on your college and then you get out and then you try to look out for the first job. And then you end up probably taking an internship as your first job, right? So the approach has kind of been different. I don't know if it's because of the time that I was studying or if it has anything to do with the region. I'm not really sure. But I think the general trend now is that your first job is highly likely to be an internship where they sort of like see what you've got.
I can see that happening. I mean, on the one hand, I do understand why universities would kind of have that. I can see how that would happen just because that's kind of what, like you very rightly said, maybe that's what the market demands at this point of time. But if that's the case, then Shaji, if that is the kind of the times that we are in, how do we then kind of ensure, because yes, on the one hand, it is quite easy to, have a student learn that program and then that gets them that first job and then they progress and so on. But then what happens, say, a decade later when maybe that program's obsolete, it no longer even matters, no one even uses it. How do they then sustain their, well, let's say design growth at that point? What do you think we can do from like education point of view?
Well, in terms of that way, I would still consider myself an old school thinker in a way, where I still believe in certain skill sets that need to be learned and need to be developed. For instance, the whole idea of sketching or the whole idea of drawing with hand. Hard to find kind of skill nowadays with kids because they refuse to draw, because maybe the smartphones, you could just photograph, you could just, take a snap and put it in an application which will make it look like it's a drawing. So there are things, there are apps, maybe that's the new generation stuff which students are comfortable with. So I'm not sure if that is right or wrong yet. But when I look at it in hindsight, like, how we were forced to, or probably we forced you guys also, because we were trained in old school. So we would train them in that old school. Like I'm thinking of teachers like Dubey sir, like real hardcore. We had a mentor in a way. That thing is missing, that connect between the mind to think and the hand to deliver, or in terms of a visual image or the imagination which is in your head needs to be shown or needs to be declared on paper for yourself first, before you do it for the client or for your boss or for anyone else. And I think if that doesn't happen, how do you convince yourself that what you're thinking is right? And that is where I feel the disconnect is. And they jump onto the other softwares which kind of limit you in a way, because let's say if you take, for example, Google SketchUp, the simplest of them perhaps. it has its own limitations, and there is this phase where you have to learn it, and that is also buying extra time, or investing time to understand it and then to apply it. By the time probably half the semester is gone, when are you going to design? In terms of teaching, I'm talking about.
Right.
And when they search for, let's say, Google SketchUp 3D images, or the shop they sell 3D whatever, they get these fancy pictures of how it will look like. I think they get inspired by that, and they want their project to look like that, the feel of it, and they're working towards that then. Right. Not perhaps understanding how the thing is generated to begin with, and then you apply other features or the stuff on it. Maybe I don't know. I mean,
actually, this reminds me of something that happened. I'm not going to take names, right? But during so Shaji sir, yeah. So Shaji sir was part of my faculty during my thesis.
There's some real recruits coming.
No, so I think So he was part of the faculty when during my thesis.
Yeah.
So thesis was an interesting period for me because it was right after my internship. So I think my design thinking had completely changed after my internship. I used to be a lot more wacky, or rather I used to try to think a little bit more out of the box, and I was less constrained in some way. But I think somewhere during internship, I felt the need to be a little bit more practical, for the better or worse, I don't know.
Right.
So I remember during my thesis, I was told by one of the faculty members that, you should just spend some time looking for reference images, see what you really like, and then we'll take it from there. And at that point, I was completely averse to the idea of going online, finding images. But I think generally there were only very few students in my time who used to do that. Because Google or Pinterest wasn't as strong back then, but it's become way stronger now, and even with websites like Arctaria and stuff have become a lot more stronger. So the influence is much higher, right? Yeah, but even then, back then, I was told you should look for reference images, and I just refused to do it. And just no, I don't want to. See, I know for now in hindsight, what he said makes sense, because this is what we do in practice, right?
Right.
It's just design inspiration, but it's up to you where you draw the line.
Yeah.
But we're so fast paced. We have to churn out concepts for big buildings and stuff, or projects in a few weeks. And this time period is often less than what a semester is like, right?
True.
So in such a short period, if you're not, the best way to get to your results sometimes is to just find a set of images, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel sometimes, right? You just have to look around. Yeah, sure. Sometimes you may not end up in a completely original idea, in that sense, but a lot of us are not don't have that liberty in this market, because everything is so fast paced. So what I'm getting at is that something that was told to me during my college days, where he was probably preparing me, right, in some way, because he was practicing, and he was one of the big architects in the city.
Right.
So, but as a student, I think somewhere I wish I had listened to him. Maybe I would have, at that time, I wasn't very happy about what how he was guiding me, or all those things. But 10 years down the line now, I feel what he said makes sense. He was kind of in some way preparing me of how to get into that design thinking and all those things. But maybe I just didn't take it in the right sense, When I think about it. This is what I was getting at. So this finding images online and that sort of thing. It's actually surprisingly, it's a good skill set. It is a skill set in some way. Having that right taste, trying to put together the right images. You shouldn't be looking for those images to plagiarize. You're not looking for those images saying, oh, I'm going to do exactly this thing. But it's almost a skill set to identify the right pieces. Right. Piecing it together.
But again, Rahul, very few students, when you think about taste, when you spoke about, the right taste, how do we know if the student is actually looking at it in the taste that we imagine him or her to be looking at?
Yeah.
Probably they are just, they like the glass facade perhaps, for all the wrong reasons perhaps. And they want to just employ that. So this is the problem I have, okay, you go through, you browse, and in fact, we suggest now, because it's high time we also get on the bandwagon and tell them, of course, there are these sites, you must go online. There's no point in, just brooding in your mind to develop things.
It's become part of design practice now.
It is. And the whole concept of, for instance, I also teach interior design master's class. The whole idea of mood board is nothing else but that. You take images from here and there and say that this is how I'm imagining the atmosphere to be like.
In fact, even clients have become like that. Yeah. So you would never have a scenario, say 10, 15 years ago, where your client is coming up with really good images, right? Yeah. Because of Pinterest, you can easily go to someone's page and then find nice. So it's a filtered list of good images. And
Pinterest for us has become part of like our workflow. So much so that we actually have interactive boards with us and clients.
Yeah.
So we're both kind of like constantly, like throwing images back and forth. So then we both, in a sense, I guess, get a clear idea of the direction that, the both of us want to take. And in the event that doesn't align, well and good, it's better to know that a lot early on than say, like 10 weeks into the project. So I can see that.
Alan, at a mature level where you're practicing and you're talking to clients about this, it helps. But I'm not sure that's my point. At second year, third year level of design course like architecture, interior design, there must also be a faculty or a set of teachers who should tell them that the things that you're looking at are relevant.
Right.
Or what is the thing that you need to get out of that one particular image that you are fantasizing about? What is that excites you about that image? Somebody must question them and find out. Maybe there's a survey you need to do. Like what are they looking for? Is it just a flashy image? Is it the angle of photography? Or there's several things that like students have all sorts of interests, and in this place, the interests are kept alive because people can afford things, and so there are these kids who are excellent photographers. So they are probably looking at an image in terms of photography, like wow, what an angle. And at that point you're wondering, is he or she even looking at how it got generated? What was the one is the technology and the proliferation of images of data really, which surrounds us all the time and literally fingertip away. On our fingertips rather. And the other is, how to draw a line literally, between what is right and what is perhaps not right, or perhaps just a fad.
Yeah.
That thin line needs to be taught in school. That how to differentiate that taste. That needs to be taught at least, because that's the least we can do, because the rest of it, the market will teach them, or the client will teach them.
No, and an interesting area which I think, Rahul, you touched upon slightly was, yes, on the one hand, that will help them develop their taste for sure. But the thing is, if you think about longevity, right? I mean, I can't speak for anyone, but maybe myself, wherein I'm pretty sure the taste that I had in college is very different from the taste that I have now. And I presume that it would also change with whatever circumstances there are. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, it's one thing to kind of teach them to, I guess, have a sense of taste, but then how do you actually teach them to recognize it and then adapt it as they go forward? I mean, because for me, this is something quite difficult also. I find myself constantly in contradiction saying, last year I used to like that, and now I'm like kind of on the fence about it.
Yeah. So if I could just start on that, there is no right and wrong taste, right?
Right.
So sometimes we tend to align ourselves to certain successful practices. And what I've noticed is that most practices have a certain
level of influence,
or a certain like a certain sensibility, right? And not all firms do similar kind of work. They all have like some sort of a design ethos, if I could call it. So I've noticed that, for example, when I was working in Shobha, like clearly say they had a certain style of, or rather what they're looking for. That Iman would have a certain thing that they're looking for, and now I'm working for Broadway Malian. So I know that clearly they have a sort of design direction, or rather a way of thinking.
Right.
So sometimes it's important that when you decide to join a certain firm, it's important that your taste or your design thinking is in alignment.
Right.
So it just simply comes down to that. It's just a sort of a matching. It's a matter of your taste matching with someone, and if I won't use the word lucky, but if it's great if if that taste
Aligns with what
aligns
you are.
with a success, certain level of success.
Right.
But sometimes you have a certain kind of taste which may not find you as much success, but it doesn't make it wrong, right? But
Right.
you may just find a lot more niche work, and maybe there's a lot less people in that sort of circle. So taste is a sort of, if you have a taste that is large scale in some sense, or more appealing to a larger range of people, then that's great. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, is what I feel.
Okay. Shaji, thoughts?
Yeah, I do agree with Rahul. Like, now we also need to tell. Like, I have a friend who told me, like, this was when I was quite young, that she had read The Three Musketeers at 3 different stages of her life, and at all those stages, it meant different things to her. So it's the same story, the same book, but at different stages, how you also grow, and the book remains the same, but you have grown as a person, and you have started reading into things which were not there, perhaps, or were not perceptible by you. Similar with students, we always hope that, over a period, like you yourself said, Rahul, that, now you wish that you had heard what. But I don't think that's wrong. I mean, because, if you had learned that at that stage, maybe you wouldn't have had that realization now. And between now and then, many other things have happened in your life which have taught you other things.
Yeah.
So it's never, I never find, or I'm more of an optimist that way, although I'm a hardcore pessimist. But like this way, I'm quite an optimist, because I think each stage of our life teaches us something or the other. So we don't have to really regret that, I should have done that.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that thing that we need to tell the students, that how the larger philosophy of life, perhaps, how it might land you somewhere where you may or may not be able to adapt, but you should strive to, get into better positions or better deals, or not deals in the business sense of the word,
Right.
but something that is mutually beneficial and at least helps them grow as an individual, as a designer, perhaps. I would imagine, and since our field is so connected with life and the way people live and all, I think it's also important to teach them indirectly the way to live, perhaps.
That's kind of like a very holistic kind of way of looking at it.
I'm looking at a very
larger context
where it's not necessarily tied to a place.
Right. Which is fair, which makes sense. And an area which I thought was interesting for today's topic was maybe something which Rahul and me could get into. I mean, right off the top of your head, Rahul, do you remember when you started practicing, right? That kind of insecurity that you had to some extent, am I a good designer? Do I know the program? That kind of thing. Do you still have that now?
So I think I was a lot luckier, like as a student coming out into the field, because there was less pressure on me to know certain complicated softwares and stuff like that, right? And in fact, the most popular software at the time was SketchUp, which was very easy to pick up. But now students are sort of expected to know Rhino, Grasshopper, all sort of things, which they probably will take a while before they actually get a chance to have a go at it, right? So I was a lot lucky that way. All I had to know was CAD and SketchUp, which was very easy to pick up. You just need a couple of weeks and you're pretty good at it. Right? Yeah. So there was never an expectation from the person hiring you that you have to be really good at software. So then there was a lot more emphasis on trying to understand what is your design thinking and all of those things.
Right.
But right now the thing is, because these softwares are a lot harder to pick up, they feel like, okay, we're going to hire you, but then you're going to spend a lot of time trying to learn the software, where we're going to lose time teaching you the software, which we need you to know.
Right.
So they're not willing to take that chance, right? So, which means that you should be good at that software, whatever. So, okay, coming back to what you were asking, I feel it was a lot easier because generally you could just jump in and start doing things in a certain, like within your skill set. You're never insecure in terms of your skill set.
Right.
But I think we spoke about this earlier, about kind of going through that hierarchy of how your work is going to be. It's like you'll have to sort of start by doing simple drafting work, right? So when it comes to drafting, you can't draft on, say, something like Rhino. So people would argue that you can, but
I don't think. I don't think you can.
Yeah.
But
So which means that Revit is the new cat, right? So which means that you're gonna probably end up spending the first couple of years on Revit, which is essentially a drafting tool. So you just have to be really good at making sure that you know how to collaborate. So again, it comes down to these softwares are a tool to collaborate as well. So you need to be really good at it in the sense that you should not make problems for others.
Right.
Simply doing a model is easy if you're just working by yourself. But you have to be good and clean at it if you're going to collaborate with others. Because if you're not going to model it in a certain way, then you're going to create problems for others. Right?
True.
So this is where it's changed. Like things have changed a lot more because it was a lot easier. The earlier softwares are a lot easier to collaborate because you didn't have to be that highly skilled, in that sense.
No, I guess the kind of the direction that I was asking was probably on a much more larger context in the sense of just being an architect in general practice in that sense, because I find myself meeting quite a lot of people who, 10 years, 15 years into practice, suddenly reach this kind of, well, let's say a midlife crisis of some kind, and suddenly start questioning things like, what am I really doing? What am I really adding to? What am I really, building towards? What am I going towards in that sense? So I guess it was kind of in that direction. So do you feel any of that right now?
So I think I'm somewhere in between. Like if I take someone of my dad's generation, they were really patient with their careers, right? Like they would.
Oh, super patient.
They were super patient.
Super patient.
So I don't think I'm as patient. Like I do want to grow pretty quickly or whatever. But I think the new generation is even more. I don't know if ambitious is the right word, but they just.
It's all about really quick.
It could be a huge influence of social media because we see a lot of young guys. Like Yakingles is pretty young, right?
Yeah,
man. I mean, so, the dude is like in Pritzker category already.
So we are looking at a lot of these architects who are doing so well at a certain age or whatever.
Yep.
But I think so. There's some sort of strange pressure that we put on ourselves to say. We have to like sort of grow at a certain rate or whatever. And I also personally actually in the field, I've also met a few people who have grown like exponentially at a very young age. In their 20s, like by my age, they're sometimes a director or something. Yeah, but those are circumstantial and
quite rare.
Yeah, so you don't have to sort of put yourself under that pressure. But I won't say that I'm completely immune to it, but at least when I started, I wasn't that pressured by it, I think, personally. But I think today's new generation is a lot more pressured by it and they get a lot more nervous. Like say, for example, I started as a junior architect. It was a proper job and all of those things. But now it's come to a situation where you're starting as an intern probably. And then there's a lot more insecurity in terms of, okay, where is this going? Is this like, that first 3 months they're trying to impress in some way, which is not a bad thing because this is also something that firms look for, that enthusiasm, that energy, which a lot of the older people tend to lose it over time. They get really good at their skill, but sometimes that energy and that enthusiasm may not sustain, right? And that the energy that an intern kind of brings into an office is great, right? So what I'm getting at is that, that insecurity is a little bit more maybe now because I think it's a social media influence where you're more exposed to a lot of younger, but again, at the same time, are you being also exposed to people
older,
almost as the same level as you're only looking at the success stories.
I think that's really interesting. So from a university level, Shaji, do you see that kind of angst amongst the students as well? Feeling like they have to hit the gate running?
Yes, because I agree with one thing, which is the social media thing, but there's also the other factor which is increasingly becoming very obvious to many youngsters now. There was this phase of star architects, Star architects. So you have the Zaha Hadids of the world and, all these, Peter Eisenman and now it's gone. So it's a world where architects are one amongst several players who are getting this thing off the ground. So that realization really has hit them, that they are one amongst several players. And the more, as at an institutional level, we take them to sites and all that. And there's this interesting thing that happens because so Dubai, the entire Dubai is a construction site in a way. So you might have to edit, but
It's true. Look around. It's true.
Look around. So, so we take them to sites, and then they realize, and then the site engineers who have a very different story to tell, who are not architects, who always keep on emphasizing the fact that, the drawings come to us, and when we go to the ground, that's not reality. And then the whole thing changes, and then to liaise with the architect and the client, and it becomes a big mess. So that story has started hitting them pretty badly because, the scale of the projects, the speed of the project, at what rate it goes on. They've started realizing that unless they update themselves, they may not be able to
Keep up.
So that also is one of the things that, is adding pressure on them in a way. Because, at least when we were practicing, like you guys had perhaps Eisenman and Zahadi to look up to, and we had perhaps B.V. Doshi and, those, the Indian masters to look up to, and the few outsiders who were introduced to us, either because of the teacher or, but again, we were always looking at these star architects. So someday we would imagine ourselves to be up there. Of course, nobody became that. But then, that was the one singular aim.
That was the pinnacle.
That was the pinnacle. So we would keep working. It's like the poor artist who's striving to get that one masterpiece, and doesn't mind, working and like donkey hours at it. There's that one single ambition. It doesn't matter whom you work with or what you work under, but you are striving for that one thing. So, but now it's like you are pushed and pulled by so many other factors, including we didn't have WhatsApp, for instance.
Right.
We never had proper internet, forget, Facebook and other things. So there's so many other pullers now, so I can imagine they are constantly under pressure. I feel the kids of now are much more under pressure than we ever were.
Yeah.
So we sometimes wonder, like me and Nilay, you remember Nilay Patalia?
Yeah.
We used to wonder, looking at the generations that came after you, what are they worried about? They always the kids look worried about. They're neither enjoying nor are they working.
Right.
So what's the tension? So what is bothering them?
Why are you so sad, bro?
Yeah. So I think I find myself somewhere in the middle, and it was. But the students nowadays are a lot more pressured.
Quite stressed out. There are a lot more cases of depression. Now, this thing has come up now. Kids taking antidepressants to calm themselves, and stories of all sorts of mental disorders that are affecting the kid because they can't handle pressure, and the pressures are insane. They're the pressures of first country, perhaps that they have everything, but they still the need to do better is perhaps there somewhere.
But that said, we're also in a space where technology is so good that, like for example, I personally wish that there was iPads when I was studying, because there are different types of like I just realized that one of the things that stopped me from drawing was the convenience factor, right?
Right.
Which means I was essentially lazy, in other words, right?
You lazy architect, you.
But what iPad enabled me to do was tracing paper on the go, or rather, the thing with tracing paper is that you draw, you can't erase, right?
True.
Because if you're drawing with pen, then you can't erase. But what iPad essentially lets you do is allows you to trace.
Right.
At the same time, you can draw.
You get the benefit of both.
So there's a lot of benefits also being in this generation where the technology sort of is out there for you to use and become better when you're. So essentially what I'm getting at is the final product, or the person who's coming out of a college, is probably better equipped than the ones who were in some way, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
But I think it's quite a fine line, right? To kind of limit and use that level of technology. Because I can see on the one hand, I can see how someone who could start off as, let's say, naively through the gateway program, I'll call it, like the AutoCADs and the SketchUps, which are necessary, relatively easy to pick up. I can see how starting off with that and then looking at what the market is showing me, which are these fancy renderings and whatnot, I can see the need to want to go down that route. It seems quite evident. I can see how that happens. I can then also understand why you would be really, really up against it all the time, because now you also have the whole social media angle kind of hitting you, and you see, colleagues or even people who are younger than you were not progressing, but probably to some extent doing, better work, reaching goals faster in that sense. So I can see all that happening. But I guess my question is a little more forward, right? I mean, right now we're still in the category of, say, people who are fresh out of college, started practice, started working in that sense. And this is maybe something which, Shaji, you can shed some light on. At the postgraduate level, which is, say, the master's level, the Master of Architecture level, the students that come in there and the kind of graduates from those kind of programs, how do you think they're kind of, I don't want to use the word of what they think of the field, but where do you think their kind of mental space is on the field?
Again, I think this would be region specific, because people who come for masters here are really needing that one degree which will propel them in their progression, whatever the professional progression. So it's predominantly that, and not necessarily to understand certain things in a better or deeper way, which is what it should have been. But unfortunately, the market here is not
as
conducive for that, unless somebody is inclined towards research, which is another thing, which is also quite new in these kind of emerging places, which are still building upon their histories and complexities of conservation and all those things in this fast-paced development. How do you preserve the past? So the research aspects are still coming out here. Topics are still being formed, because it's a young country, right? Comparatively. So region specific, if you ask me, this place, students who are taking up all these courses for masters are either because it helps them to get a LEED certified degree or something, which then allows them to, it's like an entry to Europe, or, it's like, imagine a backdoor entry, you're trying to exit the place and, get into perhaps some other...
Right.
But perhaps there's a larger goal of, going there and doing something else.
Like if I can add to that, I honestly think this, I don't know if it's this region, but like in India, I wouldn't think that you would be hired based on the fact that you have a postgraduate degree or a master's.
Yeah.
That's almost never comes into play in India. But here, I think there's almost a case of masters sort of become a sort of, it's not a deciding factor, but it's almost expected that you have one. Like
it's a desirable one by the employer.
So I almost find
that's the politically correct term. It's desirable. It's not mandatory. It's desirable.
Yeah, and also now with immigration, if you want to migrate to some countries and stuff for points, you need masters, right? Yeah. So that's also become a big factor. Yeah. So honestly, everyone has it nowadays. So if you don't have it, you're probably like, you feel like you're sort of...
It's like one of those updates that you need to have, otherwise your machine won't run. Things like that. But it's also talking about the economic times we are in, and people can afford to go elsewhere to study. There is money, and they are willing to spend to go to anywhere to study. And you had to rethink twice, thrice, as simple as putting up applications to the US, for instance.
Yeah, that
because it would be that itself is like each university would demand about $150 or something. At that point, we were like, wow, and translate it to Indian rupees, that would be huge. Yeah. So we would be selective about which universities to put our applications in. And nowadays we have students who are applying to 9 universities at the same time. Wow. 9 or 10 US universities. So regardless of the skill level, right? But the ambition is there, I can go there. That kind of attitude is alarming also.
But this is also something that adds that added pressure, because what's your return on investment? You're spending so much money on your masters. So something that generally when people come and ask my suggestion over how they should go about it, my first suggestion is please get experience first, and then go for your masters. Because you know what's going to happen? You do your bachelor's and immediately you go for your master's and you come out, but you're still a person who has no experience, right? Now, I know you're very well educated and everything, but now you're in a scenario where people who are like your age have probably progressed from being a intern or a junior architect to a slightly more higher position. So are you willing to put yourself in a junior architect position? Probably not, because there's this thing like, I went to this big university, I got this master's degree, I'm well educated. Yes, all of that. But honestly, what I've felt is that master's degree or your education becomes just a differentiator between, if I have to pick between two people, one who has a master's and one who doesn't have a master's, but with the same level of experience, I feel the experience kind of takes precedent or is slightly given more value, right? So if I'm comparing two people with 3 years experience, if one has a master's, maybe I'm slightly more inclined towards that person. But again, design and all that, of course, it matters. But I'm just saying it just becomes a differentiating factor. So I don't think people should go for masters with the expectation that it will add up to actual experience. If you're going to come back without work experience after your master's degree, you should be willing to put yourself in the space of starting out. Like, but you are at a great position when you're starting out. That's all. Okay. So, but you have to go through the process, is what I feel.
Awesome. Cool. So on that note, I think we can take a quick little break and we'll see you guys right after the ads, I guess. See ya. Thank you for your attention thus far. It means a great deal to us. We strive to deliver quality content and associate ourselves with similar like-minded creatives. We have been blown away by the work being done by the boys and girls over at the Orange Design Group. They're a boutique design firm filled with mad scientists and contemporary connoisseurs. Words cannot do justice to their work. It needs to be seen and it needs to be experienced. They push norms, they challenge materials, they build models, they've won awards. Basically, they do really, really cool stuff. Go check them out on Instagram and LinkedIn at Orange Design Group. That is at Orange Design Group. And welcome back to the show. So just before we went for the break, I guess we can summarize the first half as all us architects are depressed, anxious, people looking for something which we don't know how to find and we don't know what it is, and we're these like lost little guys going through this tunnel of darkness and not knowing what's at the other end. So I know that's a very grim way to look at it, but the fact of the matter is, I guess that's kind of how our overall, profession is to some extent. I guess what I would want to touch upon now is, if that is where we are at, Rahul, as you mentioned earlier, I guess at some point it's all about the decisions you take. Yes. At every point, I guess, in your career, in your education even, you always have these crossroads, like you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting, because I guess where you are, both, I guess, in your career and mentally where you are, is a result of those decisions which you have taken. Now, it can be said, obviously, that there's never a right and wrong decision, and you can never truly know at the time whether what you're doing is right or wrong. It's all very contextual. So I guess, since Rahul, I guess we can start with you. Any particular crossroad which came across you and you were like, you know what, I think this is something which is going to define my life, my profession for the next X amount of years? If there's anything that happened to you, if you can share.
Yeah, there's one decision which I spoke about earlier in our earlier podcast, where I think the one decision that I've made which has had an impact for the last 10 years is the fact that my first job, right? Like I mentioned earlier, when I got the first job, it was not part of the plan. Like, my plan was always to work in Bangalore, work for one of the good architects over there, and I wanted to kind of develop my sort of design skills or whatever. But at that point, I decided to go and work for a developer, and I still remember the first call I made was to Anil Dubey sir, saying, not even my parents. I called him and I was like, "Listen, I've got this job offer and it's with a developer." And he was like, "Rahul, but are you sure you want to go and work for a developer? Shouldn't you, is that the space you want to be in?" And I was like, "I'm not sure, but But, to be honest, he was a lot more positive about it. He's like, see, developers are not like before. It's not like they're not into design or they're not sensitive that way. So it could be a good space for you. So he wasn't completely like, he didn't shut down the idea completely, but which was a good thing. Like in some way I got probably the right advice or something. But my point is that decision I made has sort of taken me in this path where I've almost spent a good part of the last 7-8 years sort of just working for developers. And even now, like in some way, I find myself in a position where I'm very comfortable working with developers, or even for the consultancy that I'm working for, where we deal with a lot of developers and things. So I feel a lot well equipped to understand what their needs are, what their business aspirations are, and all those things. Because sometimes I've often had conversations with a lot of young architects who come out where they don't really understand why they're doing things in a certain way. And then, once you try to explain it to them also, it takes a little bit of experience and maturity, not in the sense of like actual maturity, but, like to understand what are the key numbers that they look for and things like that. So I've sort of like gotten into a sort of a line where I've been in a position where I could understand it, learn it from inside, and then also now take it to a consultancy and use that experience to come up with a better product maybe in some way. Right. But my point, coming back to what you were saying, I think one key decision, like it could have gone, my career and where I am right now would be completely different for that one decision I made, which is that first job. And I think it's very critical that your first job is often is underrated. Like a lot of students probably in the rush of trying to get their first job, they put themselves in a firm or a place where which may not be ideal for them, and they don't realize it at that point
how formative that would be.
Yeah, because that one decision is probably going to define the next 10, 15 years, and they keep saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to fix this, but you know what will happen? You're going to be, that first job is going to offer you a little bit more. Yeah. And then you'll be like, okay, fine, I'll make the decision later. And then when you again find enough courage to move away from that field, they'll offer you more money. And then again, you stay there for another one. Right. And then it becomes too late to correct your path or whatever it is. So you just end up in a sort of field and then you just go down that line. Right. Well, with me, in my case, I'm quite happy. Like, it's simply because I realized there was a part of me which really likes the business side of the architecture and everything. So I enjoyed it. So it wasn't necessarily a very conscious decision at that time. Right. But it's worked out well for me.
I think that's very true. I think you've touched upon a topic which I think is very, very key, which I think a lot about, because I think similarly, I am kind of in a very similar space like you, in the sense that I had to make a lot of decisions to kind of be in the kind of firm and practice and even company. When I say company, not in the sense of a practice, but in the people that I keep as company. I think that also makes a very, very big difference into kind of what you see and how you see the field in. And again, there were very definite crossroads for me. But I think what made those decisions easier for me was, I know this word gets thrown around so often, but was a lot of self-awareness. It was a lot of me being very introspective and thinking, do I really want that? Do I really want to do that? Am I really happy doing that? And I guess I was able to make those decisions because I was quite experimental at a very, young age, let's say, in terms of the type of work that I did and so on. So I guess that made me realize quite early on the kind of work that I wanted to do and the kind of, teams I wanted to be part of and so on. So I guess my question to you, Shaji, then is, from a institutional, educational point of view, how do you see, or rather, how do you think students can be taught to be self-aware or taught to be very sensitive to what they think and assess, their way forward?
Well, one of the first things that I've long abolished the idea of teaching in fifth year, because that's where RV College put me initially. Because I had a PhD, they thought that you should teach in fifth year. And fifth year, you can't do much. You're only correcting those mistakes. You can't teach because they already
You can't teach the
know-
old dog new tricks.
Yeah,
It's
they already
already too
have
late.
come back from internship. They are like,
We know everything, sir. It's fine.
We know better,
Yeah.
So you can't teach. And so I argued a lot with Krishna. And then at that point, he did allow me to come down to first year, which is where I met some of the amazing people like Sijo, Vagish, Nilay, and Ravi. And thinking, we are thinking, how do we instill this whole notion into the student's mind that the whole idea of design is so subjective that what is good for you is definitely not necessarily good for someone else.
Right.
And how do you then start teaching design? So that, because of the company of these teachers, got into me also in a way. And since then, I've been trying to follow that idea of teaching design as inherently very contradictory field where, what you think is good is perhaps not necessarily good by someone who is using that product space, whatever it is. So, but then there are also these standard things which you must adhere to. For instance, a door less than 50 centimeter need not work everywhere, So things like standards, how do you build in this whole notion that there are certain standards which are universally acceptable and done in terms of design, and there are certain things which are very notional, very regional, specific, could change with time, taste, culture. And these are the things I think we need to tell the students. And from first year onwards, I think, besides teaching them basic design and other things,
Right.
The skills of drafting and other skills that they necessarily should have. Well, I think this is where even some of these NATA coaching centers fail, because they, we have this, online. We have not online. It's a entry level test to doing architecture.
I'm pretty sure I think I did one. It's the National Aptitude Test.
for
But it's evolved
architecture
over time.
students.
It's not like the way.
Yeah,
It's not
We
the
probably
same
did it.
format as.
it's not the same format. There's more mathematics and stuff in it now. But essentially, there is a gateway through which you have to pass, to be able to even apply for architecture colleges in India. That is very Indian specific context. But then, because of that, there are these institutions that have sprung up, which are NATA coaching institutions, which actually teach you only that: how to draft, how to do things beautifully. What they don't teach is, and so when the student is coming to first year, they already
Technically
know,
quite sound.
They already know certain things, but they don't know why they are the way they are.
Right.
And that's where a lot of unlearning needs to happen. And in first year we use, at least I try to use this whole idea of unlearning, because till 12th there's this schooling, there's this whole idea of spoon feeding that happens. And after that, you are in this situation in a very global, if you want to consider Dubai as a global place, in this global context where people from all regions are there, and you're trying to find a place, and you're away from your comfort zone. And that's when we impress upon the idea of multiculturalism, of the whole notion of design as a subjective thing,
Right.
which they must imbibe so that they are always aware that, whatever they do may or may not be right.
Right.
So the idea is to be self-critical, about being critical about your own
From a very young
from a young age, from a philosophical point of view, not necessarily that I've drawn this, but it is wrong. I know it is wrong. Not like that. It's like it could be wrong. Can there be better ways to? So you're constantly working. So I always emphasize on the process rather than the product.
Right.
So and I don't mind a student showing me 10 process sheets
As
compared to
that
one
fine plan.
beautiful
Yeah.
photoshopped image. I don't want to look at that image. I want to see how she thought, till this stage, and what has become of it, and what could become of it.
Right.
And that possibility in design is what should drive us as designers, I think.
Right.
Designers as a larger word.
Right.
And then I always start the first year with a very famous late 1960s lecture by one lecturer, or an article by a very interesting architect. I forget her name right now, but she proclaimed everything is design. And that article kind of shook everyone. Like, what does she mean? So she says that everything is design. and goes on to prove that everything is designed from the table to them. And so how it is so important in our lives.
Right.
And why you are going to be so responsible for either your boss or your client or to yourself in drawing that line and deciding who is the other side and who is on this side.
Right. So I think that concept that you touched upon is really interesting about unlearning. Because I think, obviously, if you have, the benefit of learning it at a college level, well and good for you. But I personally don't think I ever learned how to unlearn. I mean, there are a lot of philosophies, a lot of theories which I get challenged on even now. And I now realize my bias for these things, which don't really have any particular grounding. So for me, that's a skill which I'm still picking up now, learning how to unlearn things. Rahul, thoughts on that? Do you think that you need to unlearn anything, or do you think it's something which you've mastered or not yet?
So this is where something that Shaji sir spoke about comes down to that process, right? So if you are someone who follows a certain process, then maybe you're kind of okay. Like in the sense, unlearning happens when someone is generally going for that last image, right? Like they skip that process and they go for that last image.
Right.
So this is highly influenced by your taste or what you think is good architecture.
Right.
Where you're not letting your process take you to what that product should be. And from my experience, what I've felt is that clients keep changing. How they feel today is not how they feel tomorrow, right? Like they even their mood and their taste, what they think is right, keeps changing. I wouldn't say on a daily basis. I would say like on a monthly basis. And sometimes projects run over a long period of time. So it's important that you kind of if you have a process and if you get the client to buy into your process, you can kind of get him to buy into each
and every
step
part
of the way.
it.
So for example, now if I take the latest example that of the work I'm doing right now, is that what we did is we first pitch the big idea. We pitched several big ideas. So you have to make sure that, okay, the client buys into that one big idea. So that's a tick. Now that stays a constant. So it's a matter of the process for me is about breaking down that whole design process into stages and making sure that you make the variables into constants, right? So you kind of make sure that each step of the way you get a buy-in, and then you make sure that those decisions you won't go back on those decisions.
Right.
So in that sense, what happens is organically you end up in a place where you yourself don't know where you are going to end up.
True.
But you end up in a place where you never thought you would, and it could be a nice product, and it's a collaboration by the end of the day. Like whether you end up in a good. So Dubey sir always used to tell me this, and this is something I'm going to keep in my mind forever. Like he would say, there is a story behind every design, every good and bad design. There is a story which we don't know. So before you jump and judge a design, a good product comes out of that a good collaboration between a good architect and a good client also.
True.
So just because someone has done a bad project doesn't you can't judge that person's skill or whatever, right? So there is a big story behind it, and maybe he's made that client happy, and that maybe the client has made money out of that project. So maybe that is all the end product was, or maybe there is a client who said, I want to not just make money but also make a statement. But you don't know what that. So when that nice collaborations happen, nice products happen. But going back to the unlearning thing, if you have that sort of understanding, there is not much then you're okay. Like the unlearning has to happen when you are highly influenced by something that you see and you're trying to strive towards that. Like if you feel like, now I personally, for example, if I was someone who said, I like Zahadi's work and I just want to do organic stuff, but there's a lot of process, a lot of theory behind that. Now, if I'm not going to unlearn and then try to learn what her techniques were or what her, like, for example, it's not something within my, it's not within my interest, or rather it's not something that I would probably find more interest in how Eisenhower, for example, how he used to break down things. Like I found it a lot more, it was complicated, but I think I found a lot more, I was more comfortable with his design thinking than say someone like probably a Zahadi or someone. Because to be honest, I haven't really gotten into how her process is or anything, but generally from the outset, that's how I feel. Right. Or for example, even how Yakin Gills breaks down his projects. Now, the best part about the way he thinks is that he has a clear. Now, I don't know if the final product came and he's just good at breaking it backwards.
Right.
It could be that. I don't know. But at least the way he pitches it or the way it comes across is that there's a clear, like it always starts
Progress.
with that blank site.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
it's like, this is a given, which is maybe a big block.
Right.
And then he's breaking it down saying, but
These are the
this
factors.
is a condition. So it breaks down. So it's almost like, and if you're going to sell that to a client,
Right.
he's not going to go back on those key decisions because there's a clear step. Right.
I feel like there's something which I keep telling people whenever I see one of those Bjork Engels presentations. I feel like maybe this is just me. Do you ever feel like at the end of it, in your mind somehow you feel like there was no other way that project could have happened?
Exactly.
You feel like that was the absolute, like that was the only way that project could have been done.
Yeah.
When obviously in reality that's not true.
Yeah.
But it's so crystal clear communicated that you can't really refute it.
Yeah.
So so
that is process, right? The process
and
is what
I think in his process he involves all the collaborators.
Exactly.
And he takes into account the urban scenario, the urban rules, bylaws, which some architects just don't think about, I think. Or they think about, but they don't talk about. But he talks about it. He makes it a point to talk to all the stakeholders of that one project, which includes the larger public also. And that, I think that helps him in, pitching it to everyone at the same time.
It also helps people feel more confident about design. So it becomes less about taste.
Yeah.
So this is where you're taking taste out of the equation because you have bought into a certain idea, which is like step by step. So by the end of the day, your taste will only elevation is affected, or materials that you use on it, only that is influenced by taste. But your final product, which is 90% of what it is, like, how your massing is or how it sits in the context, what it's really doing to the urban context and all those things have already been decided based on he's sold it to you. And then you're not going to go back on those decisions. But if it's form driven, then you can always keep being uncertain about it and keep going back on it and then go back and forth.
Right.
So, yeah.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. I guess talking about your process is quite important. Not quite important, very important, actually. The kind of key that I wanted to, kind of finally, as we're reaching towards, the end of the show, was kind of on the dynamic, obviously, that the both of you have, given that obviously Rahul, back in the day, aspirational architect, being taught by you, Shaji. Do you think you guys can share anything with the audience, kind of like, those like 10-year later kind of like recaps? If you guys can maybe, think about an incident which you thought would have never happened and it did, or maybe something which, you, Shaji, if you perhaps thought at that time, if Rahul knew this, he would be somewhere else, or Rahul, if you thought at that time, if you would have done something else, where you would have been, anything of that nature?
I think what Shaji sir used to bring to the class was sort of, because the problem is like a lot of the other teachers would sort of like be more driven towards, say, for example, you need to draw like this, you need to do this. But he was a lot more relaxed, and he would bring that sense of philosophy into the class, which I think is a very important aspect. It's a very underrated aspect of design, where how you think about architecture, there's more to it than just the walls or, like what it's, I don't know how to break it down, but I think the philosophy aspect of it and how you think about architecture is very important. And I think he used to bring a lot of that into the class, which was very interesting. And so you think about it in a different way, which is
and do you think that is something which you would share with someone who you were mentoring now?
Yeah, like I haven't. I'm not in a position where I would mentor someone or anything. But if at all, at some point, if I did, I think one of the things I would say is that just don't jump to conclusions and just try to believe in the process and I think, and he used to draw a lot, and he can draw with both hands, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned that
I feel like
on this
somewhere,
podcast.
I feel like somewhere we need to put up a picture of you actually doing that, because no one's going to believe it. But
I write with both hands. I draw also. Yeah. I write with my right hand, which is normal. I mean, which is considered normal, and I draw with my left hand.
Right.
But when I write with my left hand, it comes laterally inverted.
So
I'll tell you, you can only read it in the mirror.
So I'll tell you an interesting thing, right? So, while our juries are going on, everyone writes comments on the sheets hidden.
Left-handed, laterally
Come on, read it. I would openly write. Okay, you want to read it? Try.
So everyone's writing remarks and your marks and everything hidden, because students are always trying to peep and see how many marks you put, what comments you put. Shaji sir used to just write it openly. He used to write it. You want to read? You understand what I'm writing? Fine, great.
Yeah, but I've actually seen that firsthand, and I thought it was nuts. I thought it was some kind of parlor trick or something. But then
no, I mean it was quite by accident. I mean I just discovered it.
Right.
I didn't learn it. It wasn't I had to try.
Right.
It just so happened. So.
All right. Coming back to what we were talking about, Shaji, anything which you think, considering that given how architecture is so dynamic and we have a lot of things like being self-aware and, learning to be self-critical and so on, anything which you think from an, again, educational point of view, which if, say, added into curriculum would make a world of difference, not just as a graduate, but for the longevity of an architect?
Well, exactly that. When we think of architecture education, we are so... First of all, we break it down to 5 years, and each year this should be taught. And, the student must know at least by third year such and such things.
Right.
Which is perhaps an old way of thinking, I feel, because nowadays many things are going on parallel. So you cannot, for instance...
It's not a very linear path.
It's not a linear process. So design as such is not very linear, and it's very complicated. And I think if we try to tell this to the students at every stage of their education, then that starts growing in them. Like you're putting a seed, consistently watering it every year, it grows into a tree. And hopefully, we can only hope. Hopefully, the child, the student rather, when he or she graduates, the initial madness is to be in the race, run and, find a job or internship or whatever it is. And when all that madness settles down in the next 5 or 6 years, and then reflection happens, like, all right, what am I doing? At that point, you're hoping that tree would have grown,
right?
And it would have started, putting things into perspective, into order, into certain brackets for you to be able to see clear, all right, this is what I've understood so far. This is what I can do. This is what I cannot do. Let me try this. Hopefully, it will take me to those packets which I have not opened yet. So I feel that the education of an architect is a never-ending process. So 5 years or 6 years or 7 years is nothing compared to the lifetime of, work that one is supposed to be doing in this large umbrella called design, where we are practically deciding the fate of several lives, if not one or two.
Absolutely.
Literally. So that needs to be put in the first year itself, that you are responsible, whether you work under a project manager or under a structure consultant or under anyone, you are responsible for drawing that line that could separate a family, a nation, or anything. And if that is put in your head, I think then you do become sensitive to certain things that you do. Maybe not then at that point, maybe you're driven by the push and pull of other things, Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram, whatever. But at least that seed is gone. At least I'm happy to put that seed in.
Right.
I don't know what will happen. Maybe it will never grow.
Yeah.
It will never happen. But it might, some student like Rahul might take it. Some student may completely disagree.
Right.
But at least I've done my bit, and that's how I would look at it. I mean, as in, we can't teach everything. Let's accept it. And a course like architecture can't be learned in 5 years or 6 years or even in a lifetime. Sometimes I feel.
Yeah, I like the the thing that you just said, where you planted the seed in the first year, sometimes it's going to bloom only a few years later. Like for example, personally, something like I said, something that happened to me in the thesis during thesis was probably a seed that was planted, but it took several years for it to bloom and for me to make sense of what was told to me then. So sometimes that process is long, and what you learn during college has a deep impact maybe several years later when you recollect or recall certain things.
You might suddenly have an experience that kind of, just reignites it. You never know.
Yeah.
So yeah, on that note, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on the show. This one was different for sure. I feel like normally at the end of these, I'm normally left with a lot more thoughts, and then the rest of my day just goes in like introspecting and thinking and kind of listening to the episode again and again. But I think for anyone listening, if at the very least, it should at least kind of make you think about where you are and kind of what you want to get, achieve, reach, anything that you want to do. I guess a lot of key factors like, being self-critical and being self-aware and process. I think these are all very, very critical elements, which if you haven't learned it, you don't need to be disappointed or be disheartened. It's always something which you can pick up. It's not something which, you feel like the train's left and, you're kind of abandoned with it. It's not like that. Like anything, it's always a matter of skill. And I guess as long as you keep practicing it, you should be just fine. If you would like to reach any of the gentlemen in this podcast, we'll be sure to link them below. I firsthand know that they're quite approachable. Feel free to kind of get in touch with them. If you have anything on your mind and you want to talk about, feel absolutely free to do so. So on that note, we will see you guys next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Fellow A-formers, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being part of our journey, and thank you for the immense support we've been receiving for our episodes. It has and continues to be a very bumpy road, but we wouldn't want it any other way. If you enjoyed this episode and it brought you value, please share this episode with anyone who may benefit from it. But of course, if you loved the episode, follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, send us a little DM, and we may just send you a secret link to a secret episode which we've been working on. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. See you next time. Keep sketching.